My story, as David said, Australian Aussie character in Patriotic Latvian. It's a story of mateship, community and survival. My book incorporates relevant World War II history and that of displaced persons coming to Australia. It's the beauty of Tennant Creek, 1,000 kilometres down the track. That town is in my soul. An Aussie character, mateship, community, adventure, mishaps and survival. I too acknowledge the Larrakia people, and in particular today also acknowledge the people who've made today possible for me to launch my book. Professional Historians Association, NT, Charles Darwin University, Library and Archives, and in particular Suzanne and Amy, and Northern Territory Government for my history grant to undertake my research. Well, Tennant Creek, it gets a lot of bad publicity, but for me, growing up there, I wouldn't change that for the world. We lived there for 14 years. When we went there, Mum, Dad and I, Mum and Dad, myself, born in Victoria, and in 1968, at the age of 4, in their blue panel van, Mum and Dad said, we're in search of a better life. And so off they went across the dirt roads to Tennant Creek. When we arrived there, my mother, in the dust storms and the heat and all the spinifex flies, she said, how long are we staying here for? My father said 2 years. 14 years later, in 1981, we left Tennant Creek. Somewhat sad was I. Tennant Creek, for me, had a real sense of community. So we had a sense of freedom there, many nationalities there, the freedom to move around, people who would walk around of a night time, come and congregate on our lawns and have conversations, look at the night stars. And if you needed a pantry product, you could go on, rely on your neighbour to go and get that thing when the shops weren't open. Evidence of that community spirit is really the amount of Tennant Creek reunions around Australia and the amount of Facebook sites today as well. So also for me is the Tennant Creek, the outback. So I just love the surrounding areas of Tennant Creek, the colour of the soil, the spinifex, the scent of rain when that comes as well. Of course, there's many bad things about Tennant Creek, like many communities, but really the beauty overpowers all of that. So Dad would often take us out on adventures to the dry creek beds, to when it was flooding there, on the road, swimming in the water holes, so many outback and fond memories there. Across the road from us, now how do I operate this? There. Living across the road from us was this man, Gunnar Beckerus. Now, the spelling of his name there is wrong. This was written by a German man, and this is the first photo I have of him in Australia. And I have a much more striking one in the book of him when he was conscripted to World War II. So Gunnar, he's built his house across the road from us. I knew him from the age of 4. He was great friends of Mum and Dad's. He would make us Latvian meatballs and pancakes. He ran a very clean house. He was a bachelor, and he would come across for barbecues and haircuts and a drink or two. He was a real character. He was born in 1926 in Latvia. He arrived in Australia in 1949 at the age of 23. By the age of 23, that man, who some say had a drinking problem, maybe didn't understand his past and what he carried in his soul. He'd been conscripted to the German army, no choice, get shot or be conscripted. He was a prisoner of war under the Americans in Germany. He was a displaced person in a camp in Germany for 3+ years there. And then he had the option after that to return to Latvia. If he returned to Latvia, I wouldn't be telling this story right now. Highly unlikely, because he was considered a traitor. Because he had been conscripted to the German army, he had to fight against the Russians. The Russians then occupied Latvia at that time, so hence he couldn't go back there. And he certainly wouldn't have made it to Australia. So he said, I want to go to Canada. they said, no, you can't go to Canada, you go to Latvia or you go to Australia. So at that time, the International Refugee Organisation, you could get free passage to Australia so long as you had a 2-year work contract. He arrived, when he arrived here? Yes, in 1949 he arrived here. And he arrived in Adelaide, and then he was in the displaced persons camp in Adelaide and sent to work in Woomera was his first place, then other places in South Australia, across to Western Australia, and then arrived in Tennant Creek in 1953 to work at Pico Mines. He was then free of his work contract. In 1973, disgruntled with the new management at Pico Mine, he decided it was time for a sea change, and he had been going to Borroloola for many years, fishing up there. So in 1973, he moved to Van Diemen Island, approximately 87 kilometres out to sea, living on his own. He lived an unconventional life out there for 32 years. So unconventional. No telephone, no telecommunications, no power. He had a generator that he used sparingly because for him, if you spent too much money, you were a spendthrift, of which he has told me I am in the past, a spendthrift, and I'm happy with that. So he lived on his own out there, so some said, you know, he's a hermit, he's a, whatever else when you live on your own. In fact, he was none of those things at all. So the idea to write a book came about in 2007 at Gunnar's Wake in Alice Springs. So we were at the RSL Club in Alice Springs in the conference room there, sitting around the table. I had taken A3 photocopies of his plaque, had them in the middle of the table. There was a vacant seat, and that was Gunnar's seat. The fishing club from Alice Springs, they sat there and told stories and laughed all night as if Gunnar was sitting there. At the end of the night, one of the guys came up to me and he said, you should write a book. I thought, what a great idea. But I'm busy with my study, my career, a new family, a whole range of things. I thought, I'm a bit of a princess and I don't have time for that now, but a good idea. The gentleman said, here's my business card. I will fund you to write a book. Now, a wise person would have kept that business card very safe, but not this person. I lost and could not find that business card. So very lucky for that gentleman and very unlucky for me. Perhaps he'll read my book and have a memory of that moment. So in 2019, I was not happy with my job and I decided to resign. So I think that was the start of COVID then as well. So I started doing some consulting work, and then that was the time to start my research to write this book. So I didn't know if I could do it. I didn't know if I had enough materials, but let's start that journey. So I had Gunnar's address book, so that was the start. And since 1979, when I went to boarding school, Gunnar had written to me until near his passing in 2007. So I had lots of letters and I had lots of photos that he had sent to me as well. And thankfully I had kept them all safe. So once the idea started to write a book, I went, yes, this is my opportunity to feed in Tennant Creek into this story. And it's a part of his story as well. So I could bring in then the beauty and the character of Tennant Creek. And really I wanted to give back to Tennant Creek because it had given me so much as a child and teenager. So when I was researching and as it would all come together, and I'm sure many people here who've written a book, you don't quite know where it's going to go. But for me, 3 themes came out. And that was that mateship, community and survival. So Gunnar, he formed lifelong mates. And for people going to Van Diemen Island, people would return for 20 plus years, they would tell me, once or twice a year, and then they would take more friends there, and then they would take their children there as well. So you know, he wasn't such a hermit or an alcoholic or any of those bad things that people stopped going there. The people who went there though, they respected him and his lifestyle for what it was without passing judgment. And if they did pass judgment, I've heard many stories, he didn't suffer fools and you're no longer welcome on his island. So with regard to community, I really reflect on that from a Tennant Creek perspective. And for me, it was a great privilege to grow up in Tennant Creek. And why? Because we had over 32 nationalities in a population of about 3,000 people there. Everyone was accepted. If you were good for the community and a good person, you were accepted there. It didn't matter about your religion, your race, or anything else. So, and people looked out for each other there as well. So for me, as a child, teenager, with our neighbours of different nationalities, taught people English. A lot of people would come and they couldn't speak English there. And so if only I had been wiser as a teenager to be able to talk to those people to say, are you too a displaced person? So I really have grown a passion for displaced person, and I guess that's my naivety before I started writing and researching my book, is I didn't know we had big displaced persons camps in Australia. I knew very little of that, and I think it's very understated under researched area in many ways. Although in my book, I have a section on that from an author in New South Wales who's just published his book a couple of years ago. Then there's the theme of survival and mishaps. And for Gunnar, it wasn't all about nature mishaps. So yes, nature caused a lot of risks and mishaps for him, but gee whiz, he put himself into some predicaments as well, and those stories are in the book there. So not only, as I said, was he conscripted, prisoner of war, and gone through all of those things. On Vanderlyn Island, he was bitten by a sea snake. He cured himself. What else do you do when you have no 87k out to sea, you have no radio communications? He was bitten by a brown snake. Unfortunately, I didn't get to have that journal he wrote, so he did write a diary at the time once he was bitten and said, well, I've got to cure myself. And so he kept that journal for 5 days. He wrote to me about it, and then when I went to Borroloola, also shared that story. He's surrounded by cheeky crocodiles and often wrote about those cheeky crocodiles, surrounded by sharks. Cyclones, so he survived many cyclones, and one that nearly wiped him out was Cyclone Kathy. So Cyclone Kathy, they said, get off the island. No, he wasn't getting off the island. So as that cyclone came and got more severe, he thought, what am I going to do? The mangroves there had survived for many years, and he thought that's the best thing to do. So he tied himself to the mangroves, and what he didn't take into account was the swell of the water. So as the swell of the water come up, I've got to untie myself. There was a bit of a lull. He crawled on the ground, rescued his smokes out of the sealed container, and then went, we're right in the eye of the cyclone. Crawled back along the ground and tied himself to mangroves further up the bank there to survive. His house was totally demolished, and then the army ship come in later to check he was okay, disregarded all the prawn trawlers that were equally in trouble, and then sent help for Gunnar. He's been tossed out of his boat many times, with his boat circling around him, able to crawl back into that. Some of that was because of the waves. Some of that, I'm sure he had had a drink or two after on Christmas Day after visiting the traditional owners. He has been a missing person, tossed up on the rocks, and spent 3 days as a missing person, and another time 1 day as a missing person, and managed to survive that with police going out to rescue. And then in the book, it's a warts and all book, so there are the drinking stories there. And I just do want to acknowledge right now is that some of Gunnar's friends, they do go back to as far as 1953, I believe. And in this room now is one of those friends who's just turned up, and Peg Hapnan, thank you very much for your time today. And Gunnar actually went to Peggy's wedding in Tennant Creek, so you know, to be able to get stories as well and validation for people like that of a lifetime, and Pete looked after Gunnar in the final years before he passed over in Mandorah. So let's have a look at just some of these slides there. So the first slide there, that convoy, that was in 1973 when he was on his way to Vandalan Island. I was 9 years of age. I had gone across to Gunnar's house many times to talk to him as a child. He was really, you know, I felt a person I could talk to, but we'd talk about anything, sit at his kitchen window, look out onto the street. This day I was going outside to walk across to talk to Gunnar, and I was just like, oh my gosh, what's happening? Where's he going? Here was this convoy, and so he was packed to go to Vandalan Island. So my dad, Gordon Lowe's, he started this sketch. My husband Brian Reilly, who's here today, thank you, finished this sketch, and my middle daughter coloured this sketch there. So he had his ute, lots of drums of petrol, diesel to go to the island. He had his lighting palant, he had his belongings. The middle bit is like a car trailer, and that's his home. That's a shed he's going to build on Vandalan, and then his 14-foot boat there as well. He said he was going in the cool of night. I think he was going because that's a good way to avoid the police with a big convoy like that there. Now, his boat, the one next to it, he always had a 14-foot boat. So if you can visualise that 14-foot boat going out to sea 87 kilometres, everything he took to that island went out on that boat. So that big shed that was his house, that went out on the bow of the boat. The big water tanks he took out, that went out on the boat. So he couldn't see ahead of him, he couldn't see around it, he could only see to the sides. But for him, that's what he did. They were the risks. I wouldn't take those risks, many people here wouldn't, but that's how he lived. So that's Borroloola Bank boat ramp there, and that, if you look at that ramp, it's a bit of sand there, opportunity for crocodiles to come up there. That will come a bit more relevant shortly. So this red here is the line of coming from Borroloola out to Barbara Cove. Borroloola is actually back here a bit, and from Borroloola to the mouth of the river up here is 50 kilometres approximately, and another 37k to get to Barbara Cove, where he lived, up there where that circle is. Because of the size of the boat and weather conditions, he would hug the shore wherever he went, and obviously sometimes hugged it a bit too much, because that's when he had some of those mishaps there as well. So, let me go to the next one. Yes. An example of what he did sometimes in his unconventional lifestyle is that he would have a drink at the Borroloola pub, and then he would wait until the tide was going out of a night time. And as I said before, he didn't like spendthrifts, and he was always into saving on fuel. So he would wait till the tide was going out, go to that boat ramp, so walk, be driven, stagger down there, the risk of crocodiles lurking in the night, and then he would hop into that boat, face it towards the mouth of the MacArthur River, turn off the outboard motor, pull it up, and let the tide take him. His idea, he saved on fuel, he got to sleep because he lay down and went to sleep, and he avoided hitting the rocks with his outboard motor. His logic, and I've listened to a man who has spent the night in the boat with him, nagged him, let's get going, it's getting dark, and then was so sorry he had nagged him to get going, because he said once he turned off that motor, it was so scary out there, and that guy, it was his first time going to Vandalan and never went back again. So that's where Gunnar lived. Now this is his house. So we've got the thunderbox there. Now that thunderbox has been blown down many times and rebuilt. It didn't always face that way, because wouldn't it be much nicer facing out to the ocean there. But when this was rebuilt, he said, well, I need to keep an eye on my camp and make sure no one's stealing my beer. So he had it facing that way, and really I think it was a very underutilised toilet, because in fact you weren't really allowed to use it. You had to take the shovel and go out into the bush. So I have talked a little bit too about drinking. He actually started making his own home brew, and it was called Vandalin Dog. And so the front cover of my book was actually designed by a Latvian man in New South Wales, a Mans, and he used to do sketches for Gunnar, real live events, and send them to Gunnar, happy birthday, Merry Christmas. And that front cover was in black and white, as were all the sketches, and then my middle daughter Cherie coloured those to bring them to life, and now Amance is happy that his sketches will live on as well. So cyclone shelter, after Cyclone Kathy, he thought it wise to actually build a cyclone shelter, so it's a water tank upside down and some rocks, and that still stands today. And not only did Gunnar get to stay in that, I've spoken to some other people from Borroloola who were caretaking and had to take shelter in there as well. His house there, so that's just one version of his house standing, and as I said, I know of at least 2 of his houses that have blown over, absolutely decimated and had to be rebuilt. Very simple life. I like the picture there of Gunnar. That's when his sister Ingrid came out to visit him in Borroloola, and she, a dental technician, and came to Australia 3 times. Couldn't speak English, would come and do presentations out here and have them translated. And that's his fishing table there. Now this is one of my favourite stories about Gunnar, is that he, as I've said, he survived all the things about World War II, he survived the crocodiles, all those other things in his environment. And then on Vandalin Island, there is wild cattle over there, so he was out walking one day, and then there's this bull there he's confronted by, and he's thinking, oh, okay, I'm going to be taken out by a bull now. So he thought, okay, there's a pandanus tree, I'm going to climb that pandanus tree, it's not going to hold me for very long. It's bent over, the bull is, it's pouring, it's shaking from side to side. He thought, this is really it. And then he thought, where is my dog Sissy? So Sissy, S-I-S-I, there was Sissy 1, Sissy 2 and Sissy 3, so one dog after the other, simple. And where is Sissy? And there Sissy had jumped up, suspended its teeth into the bull's balls, and the bull was then roaring and took off and never to be seen again. So there he goes, he gets to survive yet another escape, another incident. So my takeaway from writing this book, it has been a wonderful, wonderful journey. I have interviewed so many people, people who knew Gunnar. Having his address book, I could contact many of them, and many of them are still alive today, which is great. Many of them would ring me and say, hurry up, I'm getting old, you need to get this book published, we want to read it. So, I feel a great privilege now to be sharing their stories, and everyone I've interviewed, their story is in the book as well, telling their part about Gunnar and about Tennant Creek as well, because I didn't want it just to be my perception, my story. It was important to them. I do have a passion for the outback, and I have a passion for Australian characters, and so that was really my motivation, and to give back to Tennant Creek. Now, all of that couldn't have happened. This is my dad. So, as I said, without my mum, Ollie, and Father Gordon, this wouldn't have happened. And my dad is a great inspiration to me. Just turned 84 this week. We've just come from Brisbane now, and that's in the Darwin Botanical Gardens. So a great thank you to them. And thank you very much for listening to my story today.
It's a wonderful story too. We have time for about 10 minutes of questions and comments. So anyone want to ask a question or to say anything at all? One question I've got is that Gunnar's not the only Latvian who came to the Northern Territory. It seems to me that quite a lot of Latvians end up in the Northern Territory. You know, I think many of us have probably encountered them, and sometimes in very remote parts of the territory as well. One of the so-called hermits of Borroloola was a Latvian, for example. And is there something about this group of Latvian refugees who came to Australia after the Second World War that drew them to the territory? Have you got any thoughts on that?
I think reflection on that is that for Gunnar, even in Latvia, his passions were fishing and hunting. So I guess the territory supported that as well for him. And then one of the other Latvians I think you're referring to is Crocodile Harry.
Yes.
Yes,
Very
yes,
Blumenthal, I think
yes,
his name
yes,
was.
absolutely. And lived at Borroloola for some time, and then Cooper Peating I think he went to. So maybe that freedom, I often wonder, you know, if only I had asked Gunnar more questions, but I thought that the Tennant Creek and the Borroloola was the first time, I guess since school, that he had freedom to decide on his life, what he actually wanted to do. So whether there was a part of that, but yeah, absolutely in Tennant Creek, there were many Latvians there as well, and many nationalities there. So no, I don't know why, what attracted Latvian people to the territory. I'm not sure if there's any Latvian people here today that might be able to comment on that.
Yeah, I think probably the displaced people were sent out from places like Sydney, Melbourne, with some, especially if they were single men, were sent out with better situations than working in factories, and were attracted to, like cane fields in the north or up here for work. And probably just getting far away from everything as possible after that war experience.
And you've prompted me to think of something else too, is that for Gunnar, he took 3 months long service leave where he wrote a journal, which is in the book, and went to Borroloola and absolutely, and out to the islands and loved it there. And at the end of the 3 months in his journal, and now I'm going back to Tennant Creek and the hustle and bustle of Tennant Creek, 3,000 people, and so then he couldn't wait to get away from the hustle and bustle and move to Vanderlyn Island. So that could be absolutely part of it.
I'm just intrigued, he obviously moved out there. Did he go out there as a squatter, or did he go out with permission, or was it just sort of a little bit of everything, and he just sort of did it and no one really said anything and he just got to live there forever?
Absolutely permission. So because he had been going up to Borroloola and Vanderlyn Island for so many years from Tennant Creek fishing, he had a very good relationship with the traditional owners there on Vanderlyn Island, the Johnston family. And so then what he did after many years, when he was obviously thinking about this is where I'm going to go, he actually approached one of the sons and said, so the original family member had the 2 sons out there, and said, can I come and live here on Vanderlyn Island at Barbara Cove? And he said no. And Gunnar was like, oh, okay. So what happened then is that later that day, when they were on their own, and I think from memory it was Steve Johnson, he went to Gunnar and he said, you can actually come and live here. There were too many ears around listening to our conversation, so I didn't want them all to hear. So he said, yes, you can come and live here at Barbara Cove. And then I think the benefits of that was that then Gunnar was going to look after that area as well, and to stop other people from coming and squatting and camping for long periods there. And then Gunnar was quite well known that if there was any boats in the area, he would be zipping out there and what are you doing here and whatever, and would often invite those people onto the island and became lifelong friends, which there's many of those stories in the book as well. But so that was, they allowed him to live there until his passing, which was just wonderful. And he had every Christmas he would go to one of their families for Christmas Day and had a very strong connection. And they looked after him too in those later years when he was out there checking on him regularly, or if he was a missing person, they'd go, is there a stew on the stove still? Where is he? What's happening? Yeah. Yes. And I think, Peg, your husband and Gunnar were missing persons for a couple of days together as well.
Oh, that's right, yes, that's correct.
And the police come to your house to tell you, and then they forgot to come back and tell you that they've been found.
Yes, Janie.
I was just going to ask, I take it that he didn't spend any time in a immigrant camp at all?
So he was in a displaced persons camp in outside of South Australia for a short period of time until he could find work. So I think he might have been there like 2 months before he went out to Woomera and then started going to other workplaces.
It's just, my friend was at Summers, she was Latvian, but they were a mother and children. There was no adult male, so they must have come under a different visa system.
Yeah, and my understanding, and I'm sure people here who'll correct me if I'm wrong, is that the idea was to get all the males that were coming out first because they could contribute to the Snowy River scheme and all those other things where we needed workers and to build our population here. And then they started allowing females, and actually the Mance who did the sketches many years ago that I've used in his book, he came out with his mum and siblings, and she was widowed, and they were at the camp at Hunter Valley there for many years. Yeah. So hard times for people, you know, and for me, those people, it seems, came to our shores quietly, made their life here, and you don't hear much about what, and when you talk to some of these people who came out as children, of which I've done, and I'm just saying, wow, they're reliving, you know, their ship broke down on the way out here, and so they're thinking this is another act of war that's going to happen to them, that they wouldn't make it. So you can still hear in their hearts that journey, what that was like for them.
Well, it's a wonderful story, and there are copies of the book for sale there, so if you want to read more about it, I'm sure you will sell copies of the book and also sign them. But I really enjoyed listening to the story, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Dave.
We are now going to be waiting for our